At the very height of his power, Alexander the Great, the man who had crushed Persia and carried Greece to the edge of India, fell to a fever in Babylon. His body weakened, his mind still sharp, but life slowly slipping away. In 323 BC, at only 32, the empire lost its soul. Was it illness, betrayal, or fate itself that claimed him? Alexander was born in 356 BC in the Macedonian capital of Pella, into a household charged with ambition and myth. His father, Philip II, was a brilliant military reformer who forged a disciplined army out of a rugged kingdom. His mother, Olympias, whispered to him that his blood carried the spark of gods. In that small palace chamber, a child arrived who was never meant for an ordinary destiny. From the start, Alexander's life was steeped in omens and expectations. Legends claimed that on the night of his birth, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned, as if the world itself sensed the arrival of someone who would reorder its balance. Macedonian nobles watched the young boy with cautious awe, seeing in him both the pride of Philip and the fervor of Olympias. As he grew, Alexander displayed a sharpness of mind and a restless spirit. Unlike other princes who played idly in the courtyards, he demanded stories of Achilles and Heracles, insisting that he too was born for trials beyond the borders of Macedonia. He rode horses before he could fully master speech, and his encounter with the wild stallion Bucephalus, whom no man dared to mount, became a tale of destiny. By calming the beast, Alexander not only proved his courage, but also claimed the loyalty of a creature that would carry him into countless battles. In these early years, the foundation of a conqueror was laid. He was the heir not only to Philip's armies, but to a vision, a Macedonia strong enough to stand above the fractious Greek city-states and challenge the might of Persia. But before Alexander could grasp that future, he first had to be shaped by knowledge, and by one of the greatest teachers in history. When Philip sought a tutor for his son, he did not settle for a mere scholar. He summoned Aristotle, the philosopher whose mind had cataloged nature, ethics, and politics with unmatched precision. In Aristotle's company, Alexander's world expanded beyond swords and thrones into the vast universe of thought. The lessons were not abstract musings for idle princes. Aristotle taught Alexander how to see the natural order, to distinguish plants, to study the stars, to question the causes behind every phenomenon. He introduced him to Homer's Iliad, a text that became Alexander's personal scripture. Within its verses, the prince found his mirror in Achilles, a warrior fated for glory and death. He would later carry a copy annotated by Aristotle himself on every campaign. Yet Aristotle's guidance was not only about heroism. He instilled in Alexander the art of reason, the importance of persuasion, and the delicate machinery of governance. These teachings forged a leader who could speak with philosophers as easily as he could command soldiers. To his companions, Alexander was no longer just the king's son. He was a man who spoke of destiny with the conviction of philosophy behind him. Still, knowledge could not quiet ambition. Even as Aristotle warned against hubris, Alexander's dreams grew larger. He imagined a world not fractured by rival states, but united beneath one rule. His education did not tame him, it sharpened him. By the time he left Aristotle's side, he was no longer a boy of Pella, but a figure who looked at the horizon and saw empires waiting to be taken. In 336 BC, the palace of Macedonia was shaken by violence. King Philip II, the man who had forged an empire of steel and ambition, was cut down by an assassin's blade during a wedding procession. The air filled with panic, suspicion, and the cries of vengeance. In the chaos, a young man of 20, Alexander, was thrust into the role of king. The transition was anything but smooth. Rivals both inside and outside Macedonia doubted his strength. Greek city-states, always restless under Macedonian control, sensed an opportunity to break free. Northern tribes whispered of rebellion, even within the royal court. Alexander's claim to the throne was shadowed by rumors and envy. But the young king responded not with hesitation, but with fire. His first act was to stamp out opposition at home with ruthless clarity. Potential rivals were executed or exiled. He moved swiftly to reassert his authority, leaving no question about who wore the crown. Then, turning outward, he marched south to Greece. At Thebes, a city emboldened by Philip's death, rebellion flared. Alexander's answer was brutal and decisive. He stormed the city, crushed its defenses, and razed it to the ground. The message was carved into stone and memory. Alexander was not a boy clinging to his father's legacy. He was a king in his own right, feared and obeyed. By blood and fire, Alexander secured his throne. In less than a year, the fragile crown of Macedonia was reforged into a weapon resting firmly on his head. And with Greece cowed and his authority unquestioned, his gaze turned toward the horizon, the endless empire of Persia, waiting to be challenged. The campaign against Persia began as a gamble, a young king daring to strike at the most powerful empire of the ancient world. But from the very first clash at the Granicus River, Alexander revealed a brilliance that stunned even seasoned generals. He led from the front, his white-plumed helmet gleaming, Bucephalus charging through enemy lines as if guided by fate itself. At Issus, he faced the Persian king Darius III and an army many times larger. Yet numbers could not overcome strategy. Alexander's phalanx held steady while his cavalry carved through the Persian lines. Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his family and his throne. To the Greeks, it seemed the gods had chosen their champion. But it was at Gaugamela that Alexander secured immortality. On that plain in 331 BC, facing an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, he orchestrated a masterpiece of tactics. With precision, he drew the Persians into disorder, then struck at their heart. Again, Darius fled, and the world watched as Macedonia stood triumphant over Persia. The conquest was not only military, but symbolic. When Alexander marched into Persepolis, the jeweled capital of the Persian Empire, he stood at the pinnacle of glory. Some say he burned the city in a drunken revel. Others that it was a calculated act of vengeance for Persia's past invasions of Greece. Either way, the flames of Persepolis signaled the end of Persia's dominion and the rise of Alexander as the Lord of Asia. By the age of 25, he had achieved what seemed impossible, the destruction of a centuries-old empire. Yet for Alexander, it was only the beginning. Beyond Persia lay more lands, more horizons, and a dream that no border could contain. Victory over Persia did not satisfy Alexander. It only sharpened his hunger for more. The horizon was no longer a boundary, but an invitation. With his armies hardened by years of conquest, he turned east toward the mysterious lands of India. The journey was brutal. Soldiers marched through deserts where the sun seemed intent on burning them to ash. They crossed mountains where snow blinded the eyes and froze the marrow. Yet Alexander pressed them forward, promising that beyond every hardship lay glory. His charisma bound the weary ranks together. They followed him not just out of duty, but because he carried them in the force of his will. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, Alexander faced King Porus and his formidable war elephants. For the Macedonians, who had never encountered such beasts. It was terror embodied in flesh and tusk. Yet Alexander adapted. His cavalry maneuvered with precision, outflanking the elephants while his phalanx held the line. The battle raged until Porus, wounded and captured, was brought before him. In an act that revealed both magnanimity and strategy, Alexander spared Porus and even restored him as a ruler under Macedonian authority. It was not just a victory. It was the forging of alliances that stretched his empire deeper into Asia. But ambition met resistance not from enemies, but from within. Exhausted and longing for home, Alexander's men refused to march farther east. They stood on the banks of the Hyphasis River and declared their journey ended. For the first time, Alexander confronted the limits of human endurance. Reluctantly, he turned back. By then, his empire stretched farther than any the world had ever seen. From Greece to Egypt, from Babylon to the edge of India. No map could contain it. It was, in truth, an empire without borders. Yet the farther Alexander expanded outward, the more isolated he became within. Power, absolute and immense, weighed heavily upon him. Once celebrated as a comrade among soldiers, he began to drift into the untouchable sphere of kingship and suspicion. Paranoia crept into his rule. Loyal generals who had marched with him since youth found themselves accused of treason. Some were executed, others forced into exile. Even Clytus the Black, the man who once saved his life in battle, was struck down by Alexander's own hand in a drunken rage. Each death deepened the gulf between the king and his companions. Cultural fusion, which Alexander envisioned as the cornerstone of his empire, also sowed division. He adopted Persian dress and customs, demanded proskynesis, ritual prostration, from Macedonian nobles, and married into Persian royalty. To many of his men, he seemed no longer Macedonian, but something foreign, distant, even dangerous. The weight of empire pressed down harder. Every province required governance. Every general nursed ambitions of his own. Alexander, who had once shared laughter around campfires, now sat alone in palaces, burdened by suspicion and the knowledge that none could truly match his vision. Even in moments of triumph, isolation haunted him. He was hailed as a god, worshipped in Egypt as the son of Ammon, but the titles only widened the silence around him. Friends became subjects, and subjects became shadows. In the end, Alexander stood at the center of the largest empire the ancient world had known, but surrounded by walls of solitude. The boy who dreamed of Achilles had become a king too great for companionship, too wary for trust, too exalted for peace. In the summer of 323 BC, Babylon was alive with anticipation. Alexander was preparing a massive new campaign, one that would take his armies west into Arabia and perhaps beyond. Plans filled the palaces, maps sprawled across tables, and generals awaited orders. But then, without warning, the conqueror of the world fell ill. It began with a fever, sudden and unrelenting. At first, he brushed it aside, assuming it was the toll of endless marches and sleepless nights. But the fever did not fade. Instead, it deepened. His skin grew hot to the touch, his strength slipped from him, and every attempt to rise from his bed ended in collapse. For days, Alexander lay in his palace chambers, watching as his body betrayed him. The same hands that had once wielded the spear with unshakable force now trembled. The voice that had commanded tens of thousands weakened into whispers. Yet his mind remained clear, a cruel twist of fate. He was fully aware of his own decline. One by one, his generals filed into the room. They stood silently, eyes downcast, as Alexander greeted them from his bed. Too weak to speak, he raised his hand in silent acknowledgement, his gaze burning with the fire of a man who had once been unstoppable. To them, it must have seemed as though the spirit of Achilles himself was slipping away. The city outside buzzed with rumors. Some whispered of poison, others of divine punishment. But inside those walls, the reality was undeniable. Alexander the Great, master of the known world, was wasting away before their eyes. After 10 agonizing days of illness, Alexander breathed his last. He was only 32 years old. The man who had stretched his empire across continents lay still in Babylon, his final conquest unfinished. The cause of his death became one of history's greatest mysteries. Ancient sources suggested a fever brought by malaria or typhoid. Modern scholars have speculated about liver disease, acute pancreatitis, or even a rare neurological disorder that left him paralyzed but conscious. Others whisper of poison, a plot by generals or rivals who feared his next moves. Yet no theory has ever closed the question. What is certain is the eerie calm that surrounded his final hours. Witnesses claimed that even as his body failed, Alexander's mind remained sharp. Some said he could no longer speak, but could still move his eyes, a prisoner within his own flesh. If true, then his death was not a sudden blow, but a slow, conscious descent into silence. The empire he had built trembled at the news. Soldiers who had followed him across deserts and rivers wept uncontrollably. Others refused to believe he was truly gone, insisting that a god could not die. His body, they said, did not decay as it should have, feeding the myth that perhaps he had transcended mortality. But the reality was stark. On a June day in 323 BC, Alexander's relentless march ended, not on a battlefield, not beneath the roar of cavalry, but in a bed in Babylon, conquered not by armies, but by something unseen. His death was less an end than a riddle, one that history still struggles to answer. Alexander's death left behind not only grief, but a terrifying vacuum of power. He had conquered the known world, but he had not named a clear successor. His legitimate son, Alexander the Fourth, was only an infant. His half-brother, Aridaeus, suffered from mental disabilities and could not truly rule. The throne of the greatest empire on earth stood empty. What followed was chaos. The generals who had once bowed to Alexander's command now turned on each other. Men who had fought side by side in Persia became bitter rivals in the wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors. Each believed they held the right, or at least the strength, to inherit the world Alexander had forged. The empire shattered. Macedonia, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and the vast eastern provinces all fell into the hands of competing warlords. Ptolemy seized Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra. Seleucus carved out the eastern territories, while Antigonus and his descendants fought for control of Asia Minor and Greece. The dream of unity that Alexander had carried, the vision of a single empire, blending Greek and Persian cultures, collapsed into blood and betrayal. His soldiers, once bound together by shared glory, now found themselves pawns in battles for scraps of territory. For the ordinary people of the empire, Alexander's death was not only the loss of a king, but the loss of stability. Cities burned, armies clashed, and the promise of a world united dissolved into centuries of warfare. The conqueror had built an empire in life, but in death, he left a legacy of fragmentation. And yet, Alexander's story did not vanish in the dust of civil wars. His empire may have fractured, but his influence endured. Wherever his armies had marched, Greek language, art, and philosophy spread. intertwining with local traditions. This fusion gave birth to the Hellenistic world, a cultural age that reshaped the Mediterranean and Asia for centuries. Cities founded in his name, Alexandria in Egypt and Arachosia in distant Bactria, became centers of trade, learning, and culture. His vision of blending East and West outlived him, creating spaces where Greek and Persian, Egyptian and Indian ideas mingled. The world he imagined, a world without strict borders, continued to breathe through these cities long after his death. But the tragedy of Alexander lies in the brevity of his life. At 32, he stood as the most powerful man alive, yet he never saw the empire he dreamed of fully realized. His death turned his conquests into myths, his ambitions into riddles, and his name into legend. Generals could seize land, dynasties could rise and fall, but no one could erase the aura of Alexander. To this day, he remains both a man and a mystery, a king who conquered the world but could not conquer mortality. His life reminds us that greatness and fragility walk hand in hand, that empires may crumble, but the story of a single human being can echo through millennia.